Hello. Thank you. Thank you for all coming tonight. This is the first of this year's book collecting seminars, which we're thrilled to have at least some of in person. So we'll be alternating. We're allowed to have one a term in person, so we're doing 6, I think, through the year. One a term on Zoom, and then this one and one next term and one in the final term in this very room with people, and it's such a thrill. So I think our speakers today are known to most of you, but we have Hazel Tubman from Mags Brothers, Jessica Starr from Jarndyce, and Tom Linton-Moll from Antiquates, talking about collecting historical printed ephemera. And I think they're just going to sort of do it pretty much as a conversation, and we'll have a chance to ask questions and interrupt as and when we can, but certainly at the end. And there will be the opportunity to talk to people and see a few items at the end and peruse things over a glass of wine. And I just hope you enjoy it. But I'll leave it with whoever's going to start.
Right. I will, as I'm at this end. So I think we'll probably just start by introducing ourselves a little bit about what we do, and then we'll move straight to the ephemera that we've brought and talk a little bit about that before kind of having, as Edmund said, a bit of a discussion. So I'm Hazel. I think I do recognise most faces in here. I work at Mags Brothers, and I have for I think about 4 years now. And I specialise in continental books and manuscripts. So printed material from 15th century to 18th century and manuscript material from that period and a bit earlier. I'd say I have a bit of a yen for mid-16th century Italian printing, but my kind of more academic background is in material text. So I'm kind of can't quite shake that, and the kind of anatomy of the book side of things I'm very interested in too.
My name is Jessica, and I work at Jarndyce. And when I'm at Jarndyce, I do a bit of everything. So my most recent series of catalogues is a series of 3 catalogues from the Romantic period, A to Z, and I've previously done sort of 1890s and 18th century lists and a bit of everything. But where my academic background and bookselling interests converge is in cheap print and ephemera, and especially sort of news books and strange news and English Civil War materials, so sort of early mid-17th century printed material.
My name's Tom. I've got a bookshop down in Dorset. I set up the business 14 years ago, and in that time I've seen quite a shift from people collecting books to people collecting known books, known quantities, to people collecting and buying, and libraries buying the sort of material that's unique and unrecorded and underappreciated. So that's what sort of really prompted my interest in ephemera in the modern market. I have to sell it to make a living. My academic background is actually medieval history, and I think there's a bit of a parallel between medieval history in that we're often operating in the dark with quite few sources, with a lot of ephemeral printing and particularly popular print, because we have to sort of work with what we've got left to try and survey what may have been printed, what may have been published. So I feel like that's the only link I have with studying sort of pre-printed material and historic ephemera.
Okay, right, well I will launch in. I was instructed to say to Tom, next slide please, but he's preempted me. So I've brought a bit of a combination of things with me today that hopefully will just kind of get discussion started. So the first thing is this broadside, which I'm using broadly to refer to kind of single sheet one-sided printing. So this is from Venice in 1589, and it basically issued by the Council of Ten, who have sort of gained a bit of a sort of notoriety as a sort of shadowy body of Venetian legislation on the sort of regulating and legislating the carrying of weapons in the Venetian Republic. So I will actually just hand it out. So do feel free to kind of open the sleeve and take it out and have a proper look, and there's a description with it. So it explains the as I say, it legislates on the kind of types of weapons that you can carry and when you can carry it, and it describes quite explicitly the punishments if you refuse to comply. So you would get a fine, you would have the weapon confiscated, you might be thrown in prison, and in fact, if you refuse to comply and continue to refuse to comply, you're subjected to torture and strung up by your wrists. So there's a bit of sort of quite morbid interest there. And I think I sort of started with this because that's, I would say, probably quite typical of the sorts of ephemera that as a continental dealer we kind of deal in. So that pagan indulgences, pamphlets, devotional images, and so on. And Leo can kind of back me up on this as another continental dealer. So that's kind of where I wanted to start. And I think the presentation of it, the way it's presented, and how we sell it, I think raises interesting questions about the sort of paradox of selling ephemera, something which was produced in relatively high numbers. Broadsides like that would be probably printed in the high hundreds, perhaps. Produced in quite high numbers, but have quite a low rate of survival. So how do we kind of affix kind of attach price to that sort of thing? The other things that I bought aren't printed. I kind of. Oh yes. Oh, we're ready to connect.
No.
Beautiful assistant will probably do that. So the other things I brought with me are printed, they're manuscripts, because I think my sort of knee-jerk reaction in response to the subject of this talk was, well, this is not an area that I know much about, and not an area that I especially deal in, but I think it sort of prompted me to think a little bit differently about the manuscript material that is very much part of my job as dealing with continental books and manuscripts. So this is a degree certificate from I think 1669 from the University of Padua, and it's awarding a chap called Jacobo a degree in canon and civil law. So I'll pass that around. And I've also brought a couple of leaves from books of ours and missal. What I'm kind of interested in with these is the intervention of how collecting and bookselling kind of sort of how they've worked to kind of almost make these quite ephemeral forms. I'll those around for you to have a look at. Obviously quite different to printed ephemera, and the printed ephemera was we associated with, as I say, being produced in extremely high numbers and a sort of disposable nature of it. But these, I think, there's something kind of related to that, I think, in the way that subsequent ways of using and buying and selling these things has sort of put emphasis on their kind of ephemerality and ephemeral quality. So I'll maybe speak about that to a bit of a greater
So I'm hoping that we can get.
So no, a bit project.
Okay.
We've got a
Oh, good.
So we've got
Okay.
different props now.
Okay, new props. Okay.
I
There
don't
we
know if anyone can see that. But
go. Okay. So I'm starting my very tiny presentation here with my favorite thing that I've ever bought and sold as a bookseller. And it is a Henry Goodcole pamphlet called Heaven's Speedy Hue and Cry, and it's about a sort of Bonnie and Clyde type in Islington in the early 17th century who were murdering men. So the woman, Elizabeth, would lure the men into alleyways and things of that nature, and then her partner would bludgeon them to death with a murder weapon that was printed frequently in this pamphlet. And Henry Goodcole was an amazing sort of character. He was an ordinary at Newgate, and he would sort of go and try to get their last confessions, but I think ultimately he was just trying to get a really juicy story out of the people who were about to be hanged. And so he published, I think, about 6 pamphlets. This particular one is known in maybe 4 copies, I think, this being the 5th. But what was especially amazing about this is that it was sewn as issued, uncut, so exactly how it would have been. And it was incredible to so many pamphlets are disbound, have been removed from a sort of, been put in so many different contexts and then taken out of that context. And this particular pamphlet existed exactly how it would have been sold 400 years before, which is pretty amazing and something that I was delighted to handle, and I'm happy to say it went to a very good home. This is another, where is she? Oh, yeah, that's another Goodcole pamphlet, The Wonderful Discovery of Elizabeth Sawyer. So my academic research, which I started at the University of Toronto and then continued when I was here at the Institute of English Studies, was on witch trials and witch trial pamphlets. And this was really what got me interested in strange news and that sort of ephemeral printing that obviously, these are tabloids, witch trials were printed, they were very serious, but these were printed for entertainment, and you can tell they're so sensational, they're very rich in details, and like Hazel was saying, it's sort of an interesting, one of the best bits about ephemera, I think, is that often, especially by the time you get to the 17th century, items were printed, things like this would have been printed in really high numbers, and then survive so, quite frequently. And my third slide is different sort of news books, including one that's been copied in Manuscript. And I think the English Civil War, we were talking, when we were preparing for this discussion, we were talking a lot about how exciting. Okay.
This is not one connected.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So we were talking a lot about how it tended to be conflict that resulted in the production of a lot of printed materials. So we think of the ephemera sort of surrounding the Protestant Reformation as probably the first major printing debate that took place on a public stage in print. And certainly the English Civil War was as much a pamphlet war as it was a proper war. And there's so much material on both sides, people famously going back and forth, Markham and Needham deciding to be a royalist or a parliamentarian depending on who was going to put him in jail at any given moment.
Thank you so much.
So there we're back, yeah. So I think each of these are interesting because there is there's a parliamentarian, a royalist, one that's sort of on behalf of the king, but obviously wasn't actually the king, and like I said, news from Brussels in Manuscript. And I just think that, I'm obviously talking mostly about pamphlets, but I think they can just tell us so much about the period that they were published in, and they provide context to the great works that I think we're all really familiar with. So I have a selection of news books here, one from the 1660s, which is just the news, quite a famous news book. And then Mercurius Pragmaticus and Mercurius Politicus, one of which is sort of late Civil War, and another one, the latter, which is Commonwealth. So, I mean, what's sort of interesting about these is that they're from the library of W.H. Smith, who collected newspapers, which is quite fun. Yeah, so I think, people have been collecting, especially ephemera and especially news, for a long time. But, yeah.
It's sort of interesting how he bound them up there.
Yes.
They're news books, but he wanted them to look like a book on the shelf, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that, there's a lot of things at play as well in terms of how do you deal with pamphlets, how do you keep them in a record. My first job at Jarndyce was I catalogued a collection of 5,000 pamphlets. Not an exaggeration, 5,000. Yeah, 5,000. And the eventual collection sold to a sort of very big institution in the US, but the original date range, I think, was 1660 to 1950 or something like that. And then it was pared down a little bit to 250 years. But I mean, I think there were challenges in selling that collection because 5,000 pamphlets don't take up that much space, but they can, they need to be sort of properly archived and that type of thing. So, which is another thing I'm happy to talk about. So yeah, maybe I'll just.
Okay. I just want to talk very briefly about three examples, three types of material that I deal with relatively regularly, where they turn up, in what format, what purpose they maybe had, and actually where they end up. Because I think often we sort of just alluded to this, this pamphlet collection. Often these very, what sometimes seem quite minor, insignificant pieces end up in quite august institutions, which is sort of a pat on the back to the book trade, I think. But also I think it's an indication of the growing importance and significance of these things. So this is something that I sold very recently, actually. So I can't pass it around, I'm afraid. So I'm glad we've got the screen back. It's a broadside. It's a mock playbill issued by a printer called Citizen Lee, and his imprint was the Tree of Liberty. So he was a London printer, very active in the sort of last decade of the 18th century. This is a mock playbill that absolutely pillories Pitt the Younger and his government, and it's really, I find it fascinating the way he took. This was quite a well-known mock playbill. It was actually printed in the Telegraph at the time as a sort of skit, but the way Citizen Lee produced his broadsides, I think, is quite telling of his radical background. So you see the big insert there: war, treason, and murder, and then you also see a barrel of gunpowder. I mean, this was quite heady stuff in a decade where the government was regularly in threat of being overthrown, and actually passed laws that put people in jail for even threatening to overthrow. So, unsurprisingly, Citizen Lee was always getting in trouble with the authorities. He was imprisoned at various times when habeas corpus was repealed, and he actually fled to America, which is quite fitting given that his imprint, The Tree of Liberty, is based on the idea of this sort of rallying point for American freedom, the elm tree in Boston that was eventually cut down, but at the time was very well known. The rest is history. So he went to America, and he even got in trouble in America. And sort of radical American politics. He was too radical for them. So this turned up in, I don't think I'm breaking the confidence, it was sort of in a public auction of a country house that I think Bamba Gascoigne had inherited. And there was a big clearance. and this was in a box in the corner at Sotheby's with about 6 or 7 others. At that point, I think I owned as many of these as the British Library did, because there were a couple of duplicates as well. They weren't in great condition. This is the 3rd known copy of this piece, and it's now in fittingly, actually, not far from where Citizen Lee ended up in America. So I really like radical broadsides, and I think the survival rate of these, well, as we can see, from from what we see in the library catalogues, there aren't many that survive. Another thing I like are almanacs, and I'm actually going to pass this one around. These are 2 almanacs, the first 2 almanacs in this volume. My favourite way of dealing with all types of material is, as Jess said earlier, the more original state, the better. But actually, you find almanacs survive in much greater quantities when they were bound in these pretty leather bindings. Sometimes for presentation, so the Stationers Company would bind up almanacs of all various London publishers, give them to dignitaries. But sometimes it was just country house gentlemen and ladies. And actually, it's interesting, the first 2 bound here are Gentleman's Diary and a Lady's Diary. And there's some really nice little tabs. You probably helps if I put it on the screen, doesn't it? Oh dear. Okay, you'll have to believe me.
There we go.
Oh, there we are.
Oh. Sorry, the ring is
Okay,
on.
sort of. So, across the top, you can just about see up here, 2 little vellum title tabs, and they protrude slightly from the edge. This hasn't been very heavily used. I love almanacs when they're covered in annotations, but I also find it fascinating. If you look at an almanac, this is from 1823, this collection. If you look at one from 1623, it would look almost the same. They didn't really change very much. They were a popular print, and they were really popular. They talked about calendars, they had calendars of markets, astronomical and astrological insights. But I had a strange call about 5 weeks ago in the shop from a lady who was researching the Great Frost, the Napoleonic the Great Frost was 1814, 15, and she was interested in looking. She asked me if I could look at some almanacs from the following year to see if they recorded the Great Frost, and one of them mentioned it was a bit icy one day, but they didn't record the great events because they were recording the lesser events. They were recording Shrewsbury Market, because that was more interesting to the readers. What date is Shrewsbury Market this year is more interesting than what happened last year. So it's sort of, I don't know, trade was more important than what possibly we consider history today. And then the third thing, probably load on the screen in about 5 minutes, are a collection of slip songs. And again, I can't pass them around because I just sold them, unfortunately. But I do have 2 others. So these were published in huge quantities, not very far from here. There was a big nexus of printers that published these cheap, probably what they've been, half-penny each, something like that. They were all centred around 7 dials, and there would be hawkers selling these slip songs. Sometimes they'd be bawdy, sometimes they'd be religious, sometimes they'd be rude, sometimes they'd be humorous, and sometimes they, at the top, they say, set to the tune of Rule Britannia or whatever. I sort of imagine these hawkers sometimes singing them in a Cockney way.
Yeah.
Rather than selling their lemons, they're selling, or apples, they're selling their slip songs. It's remarkable how few of these survive, given literally tens of thousands were probably sold each day. But then again, is it that remarkable? The paper is so flimsy, the printing is poor, sometimes they've got crude woodcuts on the top, sometimes you try and describe these in a catalogue description, you can't even work out what they're meant to be. So pictures do tell 1,000 words. It may be just on the cue. I've usually seen them in the past in great quantities when they're pasted into albums. So people collect a variety of things and always have done. And it's fascinating to me that people collecting these things at the time, sticking them in albums, and that tends to be how you find them. This collection, which I'd love to be able to project on the screen, was right. It might come on now. were all immaculate. And the only way I've seen these, these were a couple that are being passed around, which were from the same collection. They were a couple of slightly more interesting ones. They were all absolutely immaculate. No evidence that it had ever been tipped in anywhere. They haven't even been folded, which I find quite impressive, given they've survived this long, probably 150 years. And they were collected, well, they were in the sort of deceased stock of a bookseller called Stephens Cox from the Channel Islands. And he was a well-known collector, book dealer, hoarder, and I just have this theory that he probably added to this pile in a drawer somewhere of slip songs over the years. There they are. And the library that on the east coast of America that bought these from me were absolutely thrilled that the condition was so fresh, because often the examples you see in institutional libraries pictured on the Bodley and Broadside online database, they're actually quite torn, worn. So, like I said earlier, I like selling things which are covered in annotations, but actually these were quite nice in that they were fresh. So I just have this idea that Stephens Cox was picking these up for 5p in the 50s and 60s and added them together, and that collection was sold for 2,500. So it's gone up a little bit. Inflation's all around us. So you can see it.
Suspense is a great element of this story.
Yes. Why didn't you change it on the other one? Like,
That's
the little
Oh,
one.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Oh, there we go.
Possibly one further.
One further.
No?
Oh,
No.
no.
No, that is the right one.
So I think we've done a sort of survey of sort of things we sell,
Yeah.
and we just thought we'd have a bit of a discussion now about how the market is changing,
Yeah.
what we've experienced of it.
Well, actually, I was just going to say, before that, I was just, when you're passing around the volume of almanacs with the binding of the manuscripts, just thinking about the kind of intervention of the collector and changing, how people after that person interact with that sort of, with that, those items kind of bound together, and also how they're bought and sold. And it sort of made me think about manuscript leaves that I handed around earlier. So, for example, this one had been used as a book binding, which is why it has folds and why it's sort of filthy on one side and dated on one side, and is cleaner because that would be the side of the leaf that was facing the text. And this was sort of repurposed in the 17th century. In the 18th century, grand tourists, in the 18th century, grand tourists kind of helped themselves to leaves that they found particularly attractive. In the 20th century, you had Otto Eggy, the great manuscript breaker, who would kind of break up manuscripts and disseminate them. He was a great believer in the democratization and accessibility of leaves, and I think that sort of intervention, either to kind of, I would say, in the case of those almanacs, create something less ephemeral, and in the case of manuscript leaves, create something a lot more. It's quite an interesting kind of, I don't know, you see it over this kind of centuries, which I think.
And I think book dealers have played, a role in that. If you think about people like Mckinney, who was breaking manuscripts, or certainly during the Civil War in the 17th century, gentlemen would bind up pamphlets, news books, so that they sort of had records of what was happening, and then it was very common for dealers to be disbinding them, as in manuscripts for the more interesting and rare ones, so they could sell them individually. And I think it's sort of interesting to be, certainly Hazel and I, fairly early in our careers. She's been at Max 4 years, I've been at Jarndyce about 6. And we are obviously now taught as book dealers that you just don't change it. How it gets to you is how it gets to you. And, like those slip songs, yeah, you can put them together and you can make a collection, but you can't I mean, the idea of breaking a collection of pamphlets now sort of horrifies me. You know, or almanacs, or, you know, obviously manuscripts. We would never break it. No one would break a medieval manuscript anymore, I hope.
But, I mean, it was probably happening until 20 years ago.
Oh yeah,
Not for a month.
it probably is to
And
this
it
day
probably
now.
still does.
It continues
yeah.
to, yeah, most definitely. But it's the happily not the norm.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think there's interesting, you know, it is interesting to think of something like a manuscript leaf ephemera, where obviously it was sort of the height of luxury and importance, you know, when it was created.
To an extent, I think also though there are not, I think the association of the printing press and ephemera sort of implies a kind of sort of mass production. Obviously the production of manuscripts was nowhere near as sort of speedy as production of printed material, but there was a market, so these things, by the end, you know, books of ours were being commercially produced in quite a sort of, not fast, but in a kind of, quite a significant way with the commercial market in mind, which is also kind of, I guess, quite interesting, sort of links into what we do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have this view of sort of late 15th century Venice, obviously fewer tourists, but they were probably wealthy.
It's exactly the same.
in general. But the sort of shops that sell the like gaudily painted, hand-painted vellum bindings, there were probably shops selling, you know, as you say, mass-produced books of ours, and they were much more expensive. But you know, a lot of the grand tourists would have been wealthy enough to buy them.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, actually, I think there's one leaf still in the wild somewhere.
They might be up front.
Or I've just lost some stock. But that one is, yes, that's the one. I mean, it's lovely.
It is.
But
It's not very
can
ephemeral.
confirm. But it's not particularly sophisticated. I mean, it's a beautiful example. I could do this in my no, I don't know that. But what I mean is that there are more elaborate examples. So this was likely intended for someone of means, but not of great means.
But aren't they the opposite of ephemeral? I mean, they were meant to be your route to the everlasting.
Yes, absolutely. I think at the time of production, yes, but I think sort of subsequent intervention has perhaps made them more so.
Have they not always been valued? I mean, simply because they're covered in gold and what have you. I mean, and they're just beautiful.
I think they have always been valued. I think though the sort of I think individual leaves, yes. Sort of whole manuscripts too, but I think the sort of breaking has meant that there are now so many on the market. They are something that can be acquired easily, relatively easily. There's a lot coming up of leaves. I can't remember where. It might be Tenants, I think. And the estimate for a group of, I think, 20 is in the low hundreds, which, you know, means that they are within the reach of.
Something that's just occurred to me is we were talking as we were sort of preparing this a few days ago about actually projects to reassemble dissembled books, say, and particularly manuscripts, more particularly. And I've just thought, you quite often encounter initial pieces of manuscript clipped from manuscript codexes with very elaborate initials, and they would have become art in a way, wouldn't they? But that means that somewhere there are leaves with just holes.
Which you see,
and I imagine assembling those is even more difficult than just assembling. It's a jigsaw puzzle, but we don't even have all the pieces.
That's it. But then there are now, I suppose, it goes with the collecting mentality in that there is a sort of completionist approach now to manuscript leaves. So great projects like, is it Fragmentarium, which basically is an online platform where people can put manuscript leaves together, find other leaves that might have come from the same original manuscript. So that, which is quite a nice sort of this idea of completing all
And
the manuscript.
I think we wanted to show in the talk as well that the sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, because obviously, I mean, manuscript leaves weren't ephemeral, they weren't meant to be ephemeral, but book dealers sort of made them so. And I think there's an interesting sort of dichotomy now where like you can buy a nice leaf from a 15th century book of ours for £500 or £600, something like that.
Back in the day when I started, I used to buy them for £50. The market has rapidly revalued those.
But then if I remember when I bought that Good Coal pamphlet a few years ago, I didn't have to fight to spend that much money on it, as much money as I did when I bought it. But my employer was certainly, he was like, okay, but you have to prove to me why we should buy this. Like that, you are willing to put a very high price on this to buy it. And I mean, I sold that pamphlet for £10,000, which now seems low, right? Now, if I had it now, I would probably put 18 on it or something. I mean, because I will never ever see one again. And now I know that. But I think it's a sort of interesting, sort of reflects different areas of the market where sort of the cheaper something was, the less likely it was to survive, the more people want it. And I mean, we were talking, I sell most of my best ephemera to institutions. I think that's true of all of us. And I think there's a sort of, institutions always used to want the best copy, and now I think they want the things that represent the people who weren't represented, the stuff that doesn't survive, and the sort of weird and wonderful, like, backstreet murders happening in Islington in the 1630s. I mean, that's what, I had 4 orders for that pamphlet, and I think that it's a funny, I guess what I'm trying to say is we just wanted to compare the sort of dealer-created market of ephemera versus the supply versus the demand sort of what the sort of, institutional collecting, like what they're looking for,
We discussed this as well. One of the big trends I've seen in the last 10 years is a lot of people have gone, a lot of book collectors have gone from collecting the known quantities to the unknown, and almost having the thrill of the chase with ephemera. And I wonder if that's partly, I don't know what you guys think. Is it because suddenly the internet means it's so easy to search for the known? How do you have the thrill of the chase in collecting if you can search on 8 books and find 5 copies of something?
It's what I was going to sort of relate to that. I think also kind of relating to what you were saying about institutions. I think perhaps the finding something that is different and unknown. I think that's where you see this lovely interaction of, for example, printed books and waste paper used in the binding, or waste manuscript used in the binding, and that there's this, it is made different and unique by the ephemera which has been used to bind it, or has been used to repair something, or so there's that sort of, there's also that kind of interaction, the ephemeral element of it might sort of set it apart from a kind of sort of nice but otherwise not unremarkable, but nice clean copy which doesn't have that sort of extra, which I think which I think certainly I've kind of noticed since my time.
Because it's also sort of evidence of interaction, which I think is, again, I think increasingly, certainly institutional customers, but I think private customers as well, want things that were annotated. They want evidence that someone read this and interacted with this. And, I think there's a lot of dealers in the audience, I think that certainly that's a trend that I think we can all recognize, that there's still the people who are looking for pristine, high points, sort of working their way through printing in the mind of man. But I think that, one of the things that we have up on the screen there is that ephemera can also be a sort of, again, on sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, it can be a really great entry point into collecting because oftentimes it can be less expensive and kind of because certain things are less of a known quantity.
Doesn't take up as much space.
It doesn't take up as much space.
Yeah, everyone has smaller houses now, so
Yeah, exactly. You can fit more pamphlets in your flat. And also then sort of conversely can be sort of high points of collections as well, because if you have everything, well, then you need the letters and the contracts and the bits, you know, that surround the great texts and the very newsworthy things that were happening.
The example I always give for this sort of trend is the great collector in America, Bruce Mckinney, who also runs Rare Book Hub, and he's a sort of avid follower of the book trade and book auctions and book collecting. And within the last decade, he sold his great collection of early Americana at auction, and then is now building up a collection of Hudson Valley material. And I read his articles about his new collecting passion, and it's like feels to me like he started collecting again. He's put aside the expensive and the known 1589 tracks on landing somewhere on continent America, and now he happens across images of the Hudson Valley that he's never seen before and no one has ever recorded. And it's nice to see people's passion reignited. And we were also talking about the book fair, weren't we? A few weeks ago.
Yeah, and how I don't know if it was just me because I knew that this was coming, but it did seem that ephemera was a large feature of more stands than I would have expected. There was a large collection of ephemera being sold.
This is the first at the Saatchi Gallery.
At the London Book. But there was a large collection of ephemera being sold through one of our colleagues in the trade.
Daniel Crouch's collection of trade cards. I mean, it's amazing. It is incredible. The catalog's amazing, but the content is phenomenal. It's so representative of a period. I mean, it's really, I think it's such an exciting thing to look through, and things like trade cards and menu. Like when I remember we had a manuscript a couple of years ago that had a sort of before menus were a thing. It sort of listed all of the. It's 1806. Listed all the Indian food that the pub down the street made in this household sort of accounts book, But I think those types of things, like who was building coffins, how much did it cost to be buried, all that kind of stuff that was just information that you couldn't Google. So where was it?
And also is extremely visual, I suppose. That was another thing. In that it was eye-catching. It looked great, but also I wonder whether changing ways of selling, and particularly over the last couple of years, certainly we really took a long hard look at our website. And just people, if people aren't able to come and look at things in person, then a picture is sort of either on a website or on Instagram or anywhere else, Twitter. That is how they first meet the item, and I do wonder whether ephemera often lends itself to that way. So obviously a beautiful binding is a beautiful binding, but I do wonder whether there's an immediacy there, which...
And I think one of my favorite authors, who I've told probably lots of people in this room to read, but she has this one, she's a historian of Tudor London in particular, and she has this wonderful scene in one of her novels about sort of walking into St. Paul's churchyard in 1590, and there's print everywhere. Every surface is covered in print. I think it's so easy for us to forget that, as soon as print was a thing, it was everywhere. Really, from 1500, broadsides, pamphlets. I mean, that's how people do things. And my thesis supervisor here at the Institute of English Studies, Sandra Clark, she talks about how by 1600 everyone knew someone who could read. So when you think about literacy and you think about the way, that was the material that people were interacting more than with books, because books were expensive and for a long time.
Actually, on that, just briefly, the Italian for sort of broadside or that sort of kind kind of ephemeral single sheet is fully volante, which means sort of flying sheets, which is quite a nice image. It's sort of a kind of lovely, like kind of, don't know, walking down the street, just imagining paper just sort of flying everywhere, which is kind of
Fantastic. The only other thing that I just wanted to briefly mention is, as we talked about it while we were preparing, was it seems to me as well that rather than just catching up or playing catch up, institutions are now regularly building, and private collectors are building from fresh almost collections of ephemera. So I know that Cambridge University are collecting Brexit pamphlets, literature, and they're asking for everything, leaflets being put through people's doors throughout the campaign and afterwards.
sort of ironically, I suppose. Oh no, wait. Oh no, they're not putting leaflets through people's doors.
No, they want to
Really?
and then you said,
Well, the great Laura Massey collecting Extinction Rebellion ephemera. I mean, I think it's easy to look at a collection like the Thomason tracts in the British Library and think like, God, the foresight, he really knew that he was living through this amazing period, because he would annotate, where he found the pamphlet, where he got it, the date, which was often different than the publication date, before the publication date, often. And I think, people like Laura doing amazing things, realizing that what we're going through now is incredible, that kind of ephemera is also going to be very important. It's great when people have the sort of foresight, like Laura, to do that. Yeah. And we just really want, obviously, there's a lot of dealers and collectors who we would love to hear from on the subject.
Absolutely.
If anyone has any thoughts or comments.
Jump in.
Yeah.
Or not.
Take it all at once.
Tom, I really liked your and that's very interesting, your collection of almanacs.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting about it is, I wondered if it had actually been put together by a bookseller, with that bookseller's label on the inside front cover. And I think there's a relationship between ephemera and books. There's a constant relationship between ephemera and books. Some of these sample bands are actually being put together by booksellers. And you get classical editions that are first issued as pamphlets, and then at some stage, the printer decides to just put them all together and make an opera on it. There are so many examples of this relationship between ephemera and what we consider books. I don't kind of know what more to say than that, but I think it's very interesting.
Absolutely. One of the things, and this is related, but slightly the topic, but one of the things I think probably that unites a lot of the things that we do is the reuse of images, woodcuts and things like that, and kind of woodcut borders were really reused, particularly in kind of early Italian prints, and it's the same. It's almost an indicator somehow of just kind of the slightly more ephemeral nature of the text, or of the collection of text.
And I think that it's certainly true that booksellers would bind things, but like the collection that I did of 5,000 pamphlets, so 4,000 and 4,500 of them, say, were disbound, and disbound, not so as issued, had been bound. But then we had, I think, 40 bound volumes that had been put together with collectors, by collectors, contemporary collectors, with their sort of evidence that they had done so. So I think it's probably a mix of, booksellers were certain.
These 5,000 pamphlets have some sort of theme, or what? Any old thing?
It was a collaborative project that I catalogued, but I don't know if you know Chris and Michelle Kohler, the great sort of collections book dealers. And it was sort of the ends of like all the collections that they had put together over there in some ways. But what was really amazing about it was that, so I have I'm Canadian, so my British history, I would say, when I moved here, my British history wasn't that strong. But cataloging 5,000 pamphlets on like such, disparate subjects But it was politics and religion and social history and science. And I mean, it covered but so many things related to each other, even though they weren't sort of meant to. I think if I had got part of the way through cataloging and said there was absolutely no themes here, how are we going to sell this? I think it would have been a very different thing. But it, sort of themes emerged, and I think it provided so much context to what
They sold en bloc.
they sold en bloc.
So what was the motivation for the buy?
So, well, I'm just going to tell you because it's a very public institution. They went to the Library of Congress
Right.
in the U.S. and Mark Domination, the librarian, I was very fortunate right before COVID, got to go to the Library of Congress and talk to him about them. And the justification was just that they filled in gaps. They just were adding context to the collections that they already had, and they have obviously a very strong British history. But there was a lot on America about Britain's relationship with the world was a theme that sort of came up. What was happening in India, what was happening in Africa, what was happening in the States. And I think it just, that's, I can just talk about pamphlets all day, but I think that's one of the amazing things is that they
So
really...
when they arrive in the Library of Congress, do you think they'll be distributed among various different collections, or are they going to stay as a collection?
No, they'll be, because they're going to use our catalog. I mean, they're not going to recatalog those 5,000 pamphlets. It took a long time. So we sort of sent them digital versions of the catalog, and so it will be kept together as a collection, but will be cross-referenced accordingly, as and when they have the time to do so.
And actually, one of the things about forming collections of ephemera, pamphlets, or whatever, is you start to see common themes, but you also start to see divergences. The slip songs that were sort of splayed out on the screen earlier, I did a very generic description to garner interest, and then a librarian got in contact with me and said, "You said you could give us a full list." So I cursed for 5 seconds and then started typing out a full list. And I typed out every imprint, and I think there were 3 printers they were from. Evans was one, Pitts was another, I can't remember the third. But what was fascinating was when I was typing out the imprints, I realised that there were almost no 2 imprints which are identical. There was almost always a hyphen different in Smith Street, or a comma between the printer's name and the first line of the address, and sometimes not. Sometimes typos. I'd say about 20% of the imprints had typos in, which is remarkable given this was the printer's own imprint. You think he'd be able to spell that correctly. but I think it was sort of indicative of the sort of short print runs, quick turnaround. People weren't paying an awful lot of attention to these. They were cheaply produced. No one wanted to. I just had some printing produced, and unfortunately there were quite a few errors in it. Not in what I've given them, but they've been introduced in the print run. And I think it's sort of quite telling of the ephemeral nature of these things that they didn't take much care even about their own names.
They were busy. Yeah, but I think that this type of ephemera I've said it a few times now, but I just think the context that it can add to the wider sort of what was happening, what did people see on windows when they walked down the street? Like, how are things advertised? How did people, list their prices? How did, all that kind of stuff, I just think is so fascinating. And that's how we're going to learn the lives of the people who didn't live in manor houses and have huge libraries.
Totally. I just calculated a price list. And it looked, well, in fact, it was obviously a price list when you research a bit more about the egg, sort of rare egg seller in the mid-19th century on Orkney who produced this. But it looked like a list of British birds. But then at the bottom it says, if you like examples of the eggs of any of these birds, please contact such and such on from this. And I can remember when I was a child, people made TV dramas. Was it Kes? Yeah, about what wild egg stealing, and it's become taboo. But it was a really well-known, well-regarded almost mainstream activity. Going and stealing the eggs of rare birds, taking the fundamentals out of them, and just preserving the I don't know, loose peckled eggs. It surprised me, you know, cataloguing this price list, just how blasé about it and obvious people were.
Were you tempted to change profession?
Given it's now entirely illegal, probably best I say for recording. No. But yeah, it was fascinating, and I'd never considered the commerciality of that. I sort of always assumed people maybe doing it as a hobby.
Like clandestine letters, like I want the albatross egg. From
Exactly, but you know, wherever there's a hobby, as Ephemera shows, there's a market. Every month in London, there's what's called the Bloomsbury Ephemera Fair. It's about 500 yards from here. It attracts people from postcard collectors to bus ticket collectors to book collectors to people looking for 16th century Venetian broadsides. It's a great sort of continuation of the London trading activity, I think.
Where do you think the text fits in all of this? Because I mean, you've been talking about very, very interesting way in lots of different examples, but they vary from Hazel's example, which is a fragment of a very common text, to the sort of texts we've just been talking about, which are may be, to some people's eyes, banal, or may have been regarded that way at the time, but are now privileged by their uniqueness. But then there are other kinds of ephemera, which I'm thinking, for example, of I don't know, bills of lading or something like that, where the text is absolutely it's there complete, but the text is absolutely standard, and what adds to them is the manuscript. So I mean, you've got different types of things there. They're not, I mean, saying that ephemera is now something which the market has become much keener on. I mean, does that mean, is that a demotion of text in a way? The text that we saw being sort of dissolving on screens for or is it that institutions are focusing on things that they don't have, and they've got an awful lot? I suppose, are different things happening? It's not all the same phenomenon, I think.
I was actually going to agree with some of the points in the question, and just in relation to the degree certificate, in the text of that is entirely pro forma, so I mean, it didn't change for centuries, I don't think. So I suppose as well, actually, what kind of I've been talking about is the material, sort of the material object, the materiality of these items. I'm sorry. And I suppose something like that certificate is, with that, you have a named person, which perhaps a lot of the ephemera doesn't. So there's that avenue of kind of, I don't know,
Interest.
And kind of personalising it in some way. But also, I suppose, that is artistic. So the sort of immediate appeal of something like that is the border and the decoration, rather than the text, perhaps. But yeah, I don't know.
I think it's interesting, because I think ephemeral text often is rarer than the text in books, you know, because it's often a lot of the Civil War pamphlets and different things that I deal with. I mean, they're recorded in a couple of copies, you know, sometimes they're not digitized. So I think there's certainly some, and I mean, slip songs are funny, aren't they? Because people would have just known those songs, and probably they are recorded, and people probably do know them. I mean, there's lots of famous ones. So I think it does have to be sort of the text and the object, but I do think that the text fills in some gaps. This other thing which I didn't hand around is interesting. I mean, it's a commission basically. It's sort of 1659. It's signed by Charles II, and it's a commission that's not, it's manuscript, but it has spaces that it can be filled in, basically granting anyone who wanted to like have a go and attack the Commonwealth on his behalf, like he could just fill it out and then you could do it, you know. And so something like that is sort of wonderful, and these exist, they're known, the text is known, and in some ways this one's less interesting because it's not filled out, but it's, you know, it's still interesting.
I was just about to say, I don't know what you guys find, but if I have an unused bill of lading, for example, it's a really hard sell. Whereas if it's
Really?
yeah, if you got a completed bill of lading or an insurance document or a commission or any of these sort of
or whatever,
any of these pro forma forms.
Yeah.
When they're completed, there seems to be much more interest to them, and I think it is the personalisation. So yeah, I think it's the text and the materiality.
And I think as booksellers, you know, we need to be able to tell a story about it.
Yeah.
That's sort of the thing. Like, it's, if you can sort of make something sound fun and interesting, you know. but you don't want to over catalog as well, right? Like, that's the thing. You want to be like, you know, this is this, but like think of all the things that you could find out about it if you bought it, you know. But I don't think it's sort of disregarding the text or that's coming less important. I think just maybe the object, well, like Hazel said, sort of materiality is becoming more important, which I think, you know, I think we talk a lot about in the history of the book course, the sort of the book as an object and these items as objects that existed in a, you know, specific time and space.
Harking back to that Citizen Lee broadside, that text is quite well known. That mock label is not rare. It was published in a newspaper. But I looked at all the other examples, and none of them were so radical as to put in massive print, a barrel of gunpowder, war, murder. You know, he was really turning the guy up to 11 on that. It was making, and that's why that broadside was more attractive than several other examples which are known.
And similarly with the Venetian sort of proclamation, that also was issued in quarto pamphlets, but the only other copies I could find of it were in that quarto pamphlet form. And I think there's again, to go back to the sort of its appearance, that it sort of evokes being pinned up somewhere, evokes a particular space and sort of interaction with it, which perhaps the pamphlet does less so, not to.
You know, nailing things to doors is particularly important.
It gets a lot of traction.
Yeah.
And just to go back to, I mean, just picking up on what you're saying, but just to go back to this sort of this two-way thing between books and ephemera. I mean, you get, you know, texts by really quite sort of well-educated people that are known as sort of classical texts that you find in volumes, and they're issued as chapbooks.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get, you know, and if you don't take the ephemera into account, you're missing a lot of the story.
Absolutely. I mean, I think John Milton, right, is a great example. Like, yes, Paradise Lost is great, but like he wrote pamphlet, like he had a lot of thoughts on a lot of things, you know, that really influenced his sort of bigger writings. And I think that's, you know, if you only ever read Paradise Lost, you would really miss out on how much he was commenting on, you know, how much he was a sort of a result of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, sort of a feature of the age that he lived in, like how much he was a product of the age that he lived in, I guess. You know, it is just missing out all of that other important stuff. And also, you know, it's like, you know, what I think, like when I was doing that pamphlet collection, what was really interesting is that it would come up time and time again that like those are the things that the great writers of the time were reading and interacting with, you know, because they would have sort of read them like articles or like, so it really would have influenced what was happening on a bigger scale. But now, you know, how often do we think about what, you know, like Jane Austen was reading her, she's a bad example, we do think about what she was reading, but about, you know, other authors that we sort of think that maybe they existed in a vacuum and they were just creating these wonderful literary works, where actually they were being influenced by everything around them.
Yeah, and going back to materiality.
We're all just losing
I
the
can't say the word, but I think you know what I mean, materiality. I deal a lot in provincial printing, which I think is quite fitting given that I'm down in Dorset in the provinces. And quite often, if I find something printed by a lesser-known publisher and lesser-known printer in Blackburn or in Dorchester or wherever, you won't find any known examples of that text, but you'll usually find some reference to the printer on, a sale advertisement for an auction of a local country house, or a to let notice, or some piece of jobbing print, as it were, that has survived. And actually, I bet there are thousands of printers throughout the ages for whom the only record we have is a piece of ephemera, because the books, ironically, may not have survived in a way that a little fragment of paper has.
And also the importance of ephemeral, and this is preaching to the choir, but the importance of ephemeral printing to the large printers too, right? Isn't there the thing about Gutenberg interrupting the printing of the Bible to print 2,000 indulgences for
First
the
cash.
Yeah, just to keep them on it. So so that sort of interaction on both ends of the
It's trade, history, absolutely.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions? In which case, thank you very much for this. If you'd like to carry on over a glass of wine with no recording,